By the end of 1944, American forces in the Pacific were close enough to strike the Japanese-held Philippines. Those islands were crucial to Japan because they supplied war materiel and linked to oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. After months of debate, U.S. commanders in the summer settled on targets and approved General Douglas MacArthur's plan to seize Mindanao first, and then move on to Leyte. MacArthur recognized that taking Japanese-held islands would heighten pressure to free Manila, and he was driven in part by personal pride. He had publicly vowed to return after withdrawing in 1942. Airstrikes launched from Admiral William Halsey's task force 38 destroyed roughly 500 Japanese land-based planes and showed that resistance around Mindanao was light. In early September, Halsey proposed bringing the Leyte invasion forward from December, and the Joint Chiefs approved. The sudden change in schedule caused difficulties. The invasion fleet would rely on the 7th Fleet's older battleships and light escort carriers for protection. With the approaching monsoon limiting the use of land-based airfields, MacArthur insisted that Halsey's Task Force 38 supply extra air cover. U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz agreed, but he also told Halsey to take offensive action if a chance appeared to destroy a large segment of the enemy fleet. Destroying that fleet became the overriding objective. MacArthur, who had barred direct contact between the 3rd Fleet and his 7th Fleet, was not informed of this shift. Meanwhile, the Japanese were shaping their own counterplans, centered on the Philippines under a scheme they called Sho Ichi, or Operation Sho 1. Many Japanese officers admitted the name was optimistic because recent defeats had eroded Japan's naval air strength. Particularly experienced pilots, they still possessed powerful Yamato-class battleships and destroyers capable of long-range torpedo strikes. But the combined fleet was outmatched by the U.S. 3rd and 7th Fleets, which together fielded 34 fleet and escort carriers. Inter-service rivalry between Japan's Army and Navy meant planning remained largely separate. Even though Sho 1 depended on Army-controlled land-based aircraft, the Japanese expected a U.S. attack on the Philippines, but were not certain where it would land. So they prepared alternative plans for islands like Formosa and positioned part of the combined fleet at Linga Roads, that anchorage was secure. But roughly 2,500 kilometers from Leyte and about 3,000 kilometers from Formosa. Fuel shortages at other bases prevented refueling after departing Brunei, so the fleet could only sail once it was sure of the American target. That delay meant the Japanese force would need several days to arrive and was unlikely to intercept any invasion force during the initial landings. Nonetheless, attacking the U.S. landing fleet remained their aim. By October, Admiral Sawayu Toyota expected the Americans to aim at Leyte and divided his combined fleet into 3 main groups. The strongest diversionary element, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and centered on the 2 Yamato battleships, was to transit the San Bernardino Strait into the Leyte Gulf and strike the invasion fleet from the north once the U.S. assault began. A second formation under Vice Admiral Kyuhide Shima would enter from the south, supported by an attached group of older ships under Admiral Shoshi Nishimura. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force, the mobile force. Main body was intended to support the operation but lacked aircraft and veteran pilots. The carriers were expected mainly to act as bait to draw away Task Force 38. The plan was intricate and hinged on concentrating forces at a decisive moment. Similar complex schemes had failed before, and by the time Toyota's ships reached the area, most U.S. forces would likely already be ashore with substantial supplies. Many Japanese naval officers doubted the plan's chances. By early October, both sides were focused on Leyte, but the first major clash happened in the air over Formosa. To prepare for the Leyte invasion, Task Force 38's carriers renewed strikes across the region. Focusing on Formosa on October 12th, U.S. carriers flew roughly 1,370 sorties that day and destroyed over 100 Japanese planes. Air Commander Shigeru Fuku lamented that their fighters were merely so many eggs thrown at the stone wall of the indomitable enemy formation, reluctant to commit more aircraft. Fuku nevertheless received orders for a decisive engagement. Japan threw into the battle aircraft assigned to Sho 1. giving Fuku about 860 immediately available planes enough numerically to approach. Task Force 38's approximately 1,000 aircraft, but Japanese aircrews lacked experience. Japanese planners hoped these pilots could break through to attack. U.S. ships, while large mixed formations kept U.S. fighters and anti-aircraft fire occupied, radar operator Mike Carney reported waves of 75 to 100 aircraft. The CAP pilots described a chaotic mixture of types rather than a cohesive, well-drilled force. In the ensuing melee, American pilots shot down or drove off most Japanese planes. Though Japanese torpedoes struck and severely damaged the heavy cruisers USS Canberra and USS Houston, those modest successes cost Japan dearly. Between October 10th and 17th, Japan lost about 500 aircraft to 89 U.S. losses. Initially, the Japanese believed they had sunk as many as 17 U.S. ships. Toyota ordered Shima's force to finish off survivors. The Americans helped by using the crippled cruisers as bait. Shima cautiously approached, but soon withdrew. Almost immediately after the Formosa fight, MacArthur's amphibious force sailed for Leyte on October 17th. Toyota pressed Show 1, aiming to reach the Leyte Gulf by October 24th, but the Japanese timetable proved unworkable. Kurita's refueling at Brunei was delayed. The Marines required 48 hours to prepare, and Ozawa needed time to reposition aircrews and hoist aircraft aboard with cranes. Lacking carrier landing experience, Japanese pilots complicated matters. Kurita's force was split as a pincering attempt, while Shima's group steamed south from Japan to enter via Surigao Strait. Officers under Kurita disliked the rearranged plan. They would attack in daylight rather than at night as trained, and the delay meant they would miss striking the invasion fleet. Kurita urged his men with appeals to fortune and duty, insisting they might yet turn the tide if they met the enemy and performed faithfully. To conserve scarce fuel, Kurita routed his ships toward Palawan Passage, a corridor known for U.S. submarine activity. But he failed to deploy destroyers as an anti-submarine screen because his fleet lacked adequate anti-submarine equipment. On October 23rd, 2 U.S. submarines sank 2 heavy cruisers, including Kurita's flagship, and badly damaged a third. The Japanese did achieve some success. Remnants of Formosa's 2nd Air Fleet relocated to the Philippines to back Kurita, and a single 550-pound bomb pierced the deck of USS Princeton, detonating in her hangar and triggering secondary explosions. While light cruiser USS Birmingham and other vessels fought the blaze, Princeton's torpedo magazine blew up, killing and wounding hundreds and sealing the carrier's fate. Sailors later scuttled her. The Japanese strike owed something to luck and something to Task Force 38's dispersed disposition. Of its 4 task groups, 2 were heading for relief. One was patrolling east of Luzon, and another was guarding the San Bernardino Strait. Halsey recalled all groups, but some were too distant to act on October 24th. Consequently, when Kurita's force entered Leyte Gulf via the Sibian Sea, only Task Group 38.2, the weakest group, with 1 fleet and 2 escort carriers, was in position to intercept. Admiral Gerald Bogan ordered U.S. aircrews to concentrate on the heavy battleships Yamato and Musashi. In the initial strikes, Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats scored multiple bomb and torpedo hits on Musashi, producing severe flooding. Japanese damage control, however, kept her afloat. Musashi's crew claimed to have shot down 6 US planes with intense anti-aircraft fire from their main 18.1-inch guns. The blasts were so powerful, they said, the ships shuddered, and the wings of nearby planes seemed to fold from the shockwaves. Flak bursts showed different colors: blue, red, pink, yellow. Severely damaged, Musashi fell back to the west with 2 escorts, but continued to be harried by American aircraft. By about 7 p.m., Musashi had taken at least 16 bomb hits and 11 torpedoes and sank. With roughly 1,000 of her 2,400 crew lost. Despite the destruction, Musashi never engaged another surface ship in anger. Kurita briefly ordered a westward withdrawal, but then resumed his course toward Leyte Gulf. U.S. planes observed the temporary retreat and assumed the northern diversionary force was beaten. Inflated reports of damage reinforced that mistaken belief. Because American attacks had focused heavily on Musashi, most Japanese ships escaped unscathed, though one damaged heavy cruiser also fell back. While U.S. aircraft struck in the Sibian Sea, a separate battle unfolded to the south. U.S. planes spotted Nishimura's Third Fleet moving toward Leyte in the afternoon, giving the Seventh Fleet time to prepare. Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf laid an ambush in Surigao Strait. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and up to 24 destroyers and 40 motor torpedo boats lay in waiting at varying ranges. Opening us torpedo strikes, sank to destroyers and the battleship. Fusu, before gunfire, produced the last battleship versus battleship duel in history, dominated by U.S. firepower. A survivor reported extreme bombardment, constant near misses that threw the gyro compass off and rattled the ship until the wireless failed. Torpedoes again inflicted decisive damage, finishing off the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. For a time it seemed Shima might come to Nishimura's aid, but seeing how one-sided the battle was, he held back. His forces pursued Shima half-heartedly and eventually abandoned the chase. At about 4 p.m. on October 24th, Task Force 38 picked up Ozawa's carriers, placing Admiral Halsey in a critical position: defend the San Bernardino Strait against Kurita's weakened force, or move north to eliminate Ozawa's carriers. With the assets available, Halsey arguably could have done both. But US doctrine did not favor fighting 2 engagements simultaneously. Halsey chose to take the entire task force north to catch the Japanese carriers, which had survived the earlier Battle of the Philippine Sea. A clogged radio network and a muddled chain of command meant the order never reached everyone. Admiral Thomas Caningad of the 7th Fleet, whose surface ships were far to the south after the Surigao Strait action. He assumed Halsey's battleships were still guarding the San Bernardino Strait to the north, and only learned the truth when it was too late. By then, Kurita's formation had slipped through the strait and was steaming southward off Samar's coast. At 6:47 a.m., they sighted the thinly protected escort carriers of 7th Fleet's Taffy 3. Both sides were taken aback. One American sailor later recalled running to the bridge and seeing toothpicks on the horizon, countless vessels stretching across the water. The Japanese were shifting into a daytime anti-aircraft formation that limited their tactical flexibility. But within 15 minutes they opened fire. Kurita believed he faced full-sized American fleet carriers and aimed to smash their flight decks before planes could launch, so his assault was hurried and poorly coordinated. It was the first occasion Japanese surface ships fired on U.S. carriers. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, acted swiftly. He ordered his carriers to steam east, to gain distance, and to turn into the wind to facilitate launching. Aircraft sent every plane aloft, whether armed or not, and laid dense smoke screens. High humidity made the smoke linger, helping concealment, and rain squalls provided additional cover. Aircraft from nearby Taffy hurried to assist Taffy 3, yet the Japanese pressed the attack. Yamato's 18-inch guns opening up from 27 kilometers away. Though Yamato scored no direct hits, devastating near misses blasted underwater and damaged ships. The captain of USS White Plains described the ship being violently shaken, tossing crew and gear from their feet and snapping equipment from its stowage. Some Japanese shells were dyed to create distinctive splashes to aid gunnery. As shells began falling dangerously close, Sprague ordered 3 destroyers to charge the Japanese line. Outgunned and outmatched, the U.S. destroyers nonetheless managed a torpedo strike that put a Japanese cruiser out of action, though other torpedoes missed, and the destroyers took heavy punishment. Yamato's smaller rounds struck USS Johnston 3 times before she sheltered in a rain squall. USS Hull took up 223 hits and sank with most of her crew. As Kurita pushed forward his destroyers, Johnston attacked again, forcing Japanese destroyers to fire torpedoes from awkward angles and score no further hits, but Johnston herself was overwhelmed and sank. A Japanese sailor, Tadashi Okuno, later recalled men floating or sinking, half-naked survivors loading lifeboats. One machine gunner nearly opened fire on them until a bridge voice ordered, "Don't shoot at escaping men, Stop shooting. U.S. airstrikes, torpedoes, and harassing destroyers disrupted Japanese gunnery aimed at the fleeing carriers.
Ow.
When Japanese shells did strike, the escort carriers' light construction sometimes let armor-piercing rounds pass through without detonating, yet damage still mounted. Yamato indirectly struck USS Gambier Bay, forcing her to lag and come under sustained fire until she capsized and sank. The Japanese also lost ships. Improvised U.S. air attacks proved a major irritant and helped sink 3 Japanese cruisers while damaging several others. These actions, plus Kurita's persistent belief that he faced a far larger carrier force, led to a contentious decision. Just as Taffy 3's losses were accumulating, Kurita called off the chase and withdrew through the San Bernardino Strait. But the carrier's ordeal was not over. Shortly after Kurita turned away, a wave of kamikaze strikes hit the task group, sinking USS St. Lo. This nascent suicide tactic first emerged during the Philippines fighting. Military aviation historian Christoph Bergs noted that ramming attacks were not wholly new in 1944. Earlier, pilots on all sides sometimes tried to steer crippled planes into ships. But by October 1944, Japan began institutionalizing suicide attacks across Army and Navy. Air units. Figures like Lieutenant Colonel Tateo Takejima, Lieutenant Colonel Koji Tanaka, Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima, and Vice Admiral Tokajiro Onishi are often credited as pioneers of the special attack concept. Arima reportedly died on October 15th while attempting to ram USS Franklin, and Onishi, initially opposed, used Arima's action to start ordering squadron-level suicide missions in the Philippines. The rationale was stark. Air units in the Philippines were already under extreme pressure and unlikely to survive long. So commanders told crews they would soon die anyway, and that suicide missions offered a chance to inflict greater losses. Early kamikaze strikes surprised Allied forces during the Philippine campaign, and their initial effectiveness may have surprised the Japanese as well. Allied estimates for the early period suggested kamikaze attacks had roughly 10 times the chance of scoring a hit compared with conventional bombing sorties. In that phase, these attacks sank or damaged about 40 ships in the area and struck 7 carriers, including the aforementioned St. Lo. October 1944 proved only the beginning, encouraged by early results. Japan massively expanded special attack units as its strategic situation worsened. Not every kamikaze came from an organized unit, but identified suicide sorties increased by roughly 60% between 1944 and 1945. During the Okinawa campaign in April-May 1945, Japan flew more kamikaze sorties in that 2-month window than in the entire October 1944-March 1945 period, yet managed about the same number of hits, showing declining effectiveness even as sorties rose. The Allies adapted. One notable countermeasure was the VT variable time proximity fuse, which used a sensor to detonate shells at the optimal moment near aircraft rather than on a preset timer. Between October 1944 and March 1945, a plane entering shipboard AA range faced about a 73% chance of a hit or near miss. By April-May 1945, that figure fell to roughly 43%. And it continued to drop as AA and fire control improved. Early warning radars and fighter interception were equally crucial. Radar-equipped destroyer pickets placed well ahead of task forces detected kamikaze raids and allowed fighters to be vectored to intercept. Statistically, if a kamikaze was intercepted about 10 miles from a ship, it still had roughly a 50% chance of reaching the vessel. If intercepted 50 miles out, the chance fell to about 2%. That is why only roughly a third of kamikaze sorties even approached a task force. Early warning with fighter vectoring proved the most effective defense, with layered AA fire as a critical backup. Most kamikaze hits actually struck auxiliary transports landing ships, and radar picket switch often carried the early warning radars Japanese pilots spotted first. These lightly trained pilots typically aimed at the first ships they encountered. Around 170 hits were scored on destroyers and auxiliary vessels versus about 25 hits on carriers. By war's end, close to 4,000 Japanese pilots had taken part in suicide missions, scoring roughly 450 hits or near misses, sinking 66 Allied ships, and damaging several hundred more. Allied casualties included some 6,200 killed and about 8,700 wounded. Despite notable tactical successes early on, kamikaze operations did not change the strategic balance in the Pacific. Some historians later argued Kurita might have pushed into the Gulf and met Show One's objectives by engaging the invasion armada. But this suggestion remains contested. Kurita later cited fatigue, fear of air attack, fuel worries, and the belief that remaining targets in the Gulf would be empty transports as reasons for withdrawing. Some Japanese officers, such as Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, claimed Kurita preferred to go down fighting U.S. warships rather than attack empty transports. Officers argued that if they did enter Leyte Gulf, they might find transports already withdrawn, and any gains would be negligible. They were prepared to fight to the end, but desired to die honorably. Convinced enemy carrier groups were nearby, and that shore-based air support had been limited, Kurita also did not know Ozawa had successfully drawn Task Force 38 away. And even had he stormed the Gulf, stronger U.S. forces might have counterattacked. With Kurita withdrawing, Halsey turned north against Ozawa's diversionary carrier group off Cape Engaño. The Americans viewed those carriers as a major threat because they did not realize most Japanese carrier aircraft had already been destroyed. Task Force 38 struck in the early hours of October 25th, concentrating on Ozawa's first mobile fleet. And 3 light carriers. Ozawa managed to launch only 13 planes in defense. Pilot Bill Davis, flying a Hellcat from Lexington, later recalled diving so low he glimpsed Japanese officers on the bridge. An admiral in dress whites and sword, an image he never forgot. Asterisk. In a coordinated strike, U.S. planes hit Zuokaku with armor-piercing bombs and 6 torpedoes. Listing heavily, her crew assembled on deck, lowered the ensign, and abandoned ship before she sank. By afternoon, U.S. aircraft had sunk 1 destroyer and 3 of 4 Japanese carriers and crippled the 4th. Yet despite the largest carrier airstrike of the war, 527 Sortiza results, disappointed somewhat Japanese maneuvering and fierce AA fire limited accuracy, and pilot exhaustion reduced effectiveness. When desperate calls for help came from the 7th Fleet, Halsey lacked the fast battleships to finish the action. After turning his force, he was also too slow to catch Kurita's withdrawing ships, though his forces sank a stray destroyer. The actions off Cape Engaño effectively ended major surface combat in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. Because the naval actions unfolded alongside large land battles, historians debate exact beginnings and endings, and casualty tallies vary. U.S. naval casualties are often reported as about 473 killed, 1,110 missing, and 1,220 wounded, not counting roughly 1,750 U.S. POS killed when the submarine I both sank the Japanese prisoner transport. Arisen Maru, on October 24th, Japanese losses numbered around 13,000 killed. In ship counts, the U.S. lost 11 of roughly 300 vessels involved. Japan lost 28 of 69 ships, signed to Show One. On the surface, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a decisive U.S. victory, though some critics argue America might have inflicted even greater damage with fewer losses and point fingers at Admiral Halsey's decisions. Critics claim Halsey fell for the Japanese feint, and thus handed them their best shot at success in the Leyte Gulf by abandoning the San Bernardino Strait, despite some intelligence officers' warnings. Halsey was popular with the public, but had uneasy relations with peers and superiors. Some suggest he sought a dramatic triumph to bolster a career that lagged behind peers like Admirals Raymond Spruance and Mark Mitcher, perhaps favoring personal glory over protecting the Gulf. Defenders counter that judging Halsey by information available only after the fact is unfair, and note that Nimitz had directed him to concentrate on carriers if they appeared. Intelligence about Japanese dispositions was poor and communications unreliable. When Halsey steamed north, he believed Kurita's force had been shattered and posed no grave threat. Halsey later explained that guarding the San Bernardino Strait seemed futile, and he preferred to concentrate TF-38 to strike the Japanese carriers at dawn. Convinced Kurita had been heavily damaged in the Sibuyan Sea, the whole operation suffered from a convoluted, fragmented command arrangement created by coordinating previously separate commands and managing strong personalities like MacArthur and Halsey. Even so, Leyte Gulf was clearly a U.S. triumph, a point admitted by some Japanese commanders. One Japanese officer said the enemy had cleaned up the sea thoroughly, leaving little and feeling like a victor picking over remnants. For many Japanese naval leaders, the defeat was not a shock. Confidence in Show 1 was low beforehand. And historians argue the plan stood little chance even if everything had gone to schedule. Some officers shaped the outcome as honorable death. Please give the combined fleet the chance to bloom as flowers of death, they urged. Yet that ideal was nearly impossible to achieve. The Japanese left so late they could not hope to intercept the U.S. invasion armada during the landings. At best, they might find empty transports or obsolete. Escorts hardly worth sacrificing the Imperial Navy. The notion of a decisive fleet battle was a holdover from pre-war thinking and ignored the immense gap in naval air power. Kurita arguably retained an opportunity to push into the Gulf after engaging Taffy 3, but he had no means to affect the land fighting that Show 1 sought to influence. Meanwhile, MacArthur's ground campaign pressed on to fulfill his 1942 pledge, and liberating the Philippines proved to be a protracted, bitter, and costly endeavor. As American forces inched closer to Japan's home islands, Allied pressure was also mounting decisively against Nazi Germany and across Europe. By early 1945 U.S. British and French armies were poised to cross the Rhine, while Soviet forces stood on the Oder's banks, ready to strike